Yay.
Okay, well, thank you. So I want to talk to you about some events 31 years ago, and the photos I'm showing you are mine. And it's my experience with Russian tanks. And I know personally, I'm not brave. When I see a Russian tank coming down the street, I run. I do take a picture. But it's important to remember that in 1989, remember that famous photo on Tiananmen Square where the guy stopped the tank by standing there. And that was just 2 years before this that I'm showing you. And so unfortunately in Lithuania, many of the students thought, well, that'll happen with us too. And they were wrong. They were just crushed. Where is Lithuania? Well, it's a small country in Eastern Europe. It has a language that's close to Sanskrit, which is nowhere near anything there. So it's really unique. It used to have part of Belarus and Ukraine was part of the Lithuanian Empire. So unlike Latvia and Estonia, they have a kind of big mentality. Like we used to run all of that. So they're different that way. To the left of it is a little green area here called, now called Kaliningrad, but that's the former East Prussia. And the Prussian language and culture has been obliterated. There's nothing left. Often the obliteration was done by Russian tanks. So that's one place where artillery and tanks by Russians have wiped something out. From that area, Kaliningrad, which was Königsberg, when it was German, was Hannah Arendt, and she was a philosopher and in 1961 a reporter for the New Yorker, and she went to the trial of Adolf Eichmann, who ran the Holocaust in Israel. And she famously was struck by the banality of evil. That is, can one do evil without being evil? And when she met Eichmann, she was struck about how ordinary he was, how he was just a bureaucrat. He was not a frothing at the mouth Nazi. So she said, yes, you could not be evil. And so she wrote of Eichmann, I was struck by the manifest shallowness in the doer, Eichmann, which made it impossible to trace the uncontestable evil of his deeds to any deeper level of roots or motives. The deeds were monstrous, but the doer, Eichmann, at least the very effective one now on trial, was quite ordinary, commonplace, and neither demonic or monstrous. And I would argue that's often the case with the Russian tank commanders too. So brief timeline here. I don't want to get too academic. In 1919, Lithuania has been, since then, the past 100 years, basically a doormat for German, Poles, and Russians to overrun the country with tanks. Vilnius was even separated, the capital that you can see barely there, and was part of Poland between the two world wars because Poland had a dictatorship. But in 1939, it was finally rejoined with Lithuania in the spring, but World War II started in September, and the secret pact between Hitler and Stalin meant there were Russian tanks on the streets in 1939-40 as the Soviet army took their piece of Poland in agreement with Hitler. There was a young Lithuanian there by the name of Vilnius, and he witnessed that. In 1941, the German tanks came on the streets with the invasion of the Soviet Union, and Vilnius witnessed that as well. In 1944, the Russian tanks came back and stayed. And I'll show you a military base that they had set up, and Lithuania was incorporated into the Soviet Union. And so that's ancient history. About 40 years later, in the mid-1980s at Ohio State in Columbus, they decided to have an interdisciplinary course on the Soviet Union. And so they grabbed people from different departments and said, come, spend a week talking about the Soviet Union from your perspective. So my advisor and I did a week on the Soviet economy. And one feature of the Soviet economy was window glass, for example, was very thick and not of high quality because you produced it just by the ton. It didn't matter what the customer thought. So keep in mind, I'll bring up why that's important in just a second. They brought this guy in from the literature department. It was a professor, Shilba Yoris, and he had been at Ohio State, and he studied Russian and East European literature, but he was Lithuanian. So he talked about tanks in the streets of Vilnius, no photos or anything, just got up, and I was listening to him, you know, and then I headed out to, you know, grad school, headed over to the library or something. It's like, okay, that's a nice piece of history and it's far away. And so that was nice. Little did I know that just 3 years later, when I got to Kent State on my first job, they said, we're trying to set up this exchange in Vilnius, in Lithuania. And our president of the university has been over there. And we were wondering if you would go over for a semester. So I said, yeah, of course, even though it was Soviet Union. And I didn't get my visa until 3 days before I left. And everything went through Moscow. So you had to take a train from Moscow, take an airplane first. So you first had to go to Moscow and then you come in to Vilnius, Lithuania. So I taught there in the fall of 1990. And it was, I'll show you some pictures from then. They didn't really know what to do with me. First of all, economics was all Marxian philosophy. So supply and demand, they were like, okay. So, but I met a Lithuanian professor who said he was an economist, but actually he was a marketing professor. And he had just gotten his PhD in 1989, but he was much older than me because he got a European style PhD. And his name was Vytautas Pranulis. And he became my really good friend. And unfortunately, but last year he died of cancer. So I was, whoops, and so is the screen. Start, okay, good, thank you. So I want to show you then my pictures. And so what happens in the fall of 1990, the Lithuanians start to move away from the Soviet Union. They want to separate from the Russians. And the street signs were in Russian and Lithuanian. They started to rip off the Russian street signs. I suspect in southern Ukraine, the Russian street signs are going back up. The statues of Lenin that stood in the square were torn down. They're now in a museum in a field where they belong. That's relevant here to Statesboro, by the way. We got some statues that need to go to the museum. Little things just started to happen during the fall of 1990. But it was very much the Soviet Union. In the spring of 1990, a delegation from Lithuania had come to Kent State, and one of them, just anytime he had a chance to speak, like in a setting like this, would say, "We want independence." And it was like a broken record. I found out later that this guy was called the Bulldozer, that was his nickname. And he was just wanted to make sure that everyone knew we want separate from the Soviet Union. Okay. So I was in Moscow after my semester was over, and I heard in early January that the Russians had sent tanks into Vilnius, and I decided I needed to go back and stand with my Lithuanian friends, not in front of tanks, but I needed to go back there. So to my surprise, I hopped on a train from Moscow, went to Vilnius, and there was almost no one on it, but I got out, and so many of the killings that had occurred one night, I got there like the day after. So they took me and I toured one of the hospitals with the students who were still alive, who had stood in front of the tanks. You know, they had their arm or their leg smashed and things like that. And so this was real evil. And so that's what I want to show you here. Now, since we're in church, this is a Russian Orthodox church in Lithuania. And Lithuania has about 9% Russian population. This is more important now for Ukraine than for Lithuania. Lithuania is predominantly Catholic or pagan, and the Russian Orthodox Church is kind of left alone there. But if you look at Ukraine now, there's a real struggle going on between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church, which endorses the war that Putin has created, which is horrible. And there is a small Ukrainian Catholic church, of course, and that's interesting in that that's the only branch of the Catholic Church where priests can marry. That is also in the mix in Ukraine. In the spring of 1990, this should sound familiar, the Russians said, we don't like what's going on in Lithuania, so we're going to cut off your oil. So these are Lithuanians frantically filling up their gas tanks. You can see the Soviet Moskvich cars that everybody drove. And they also bicycled. They had a bicycle protest where they said, we're all going to bike and not even buy the gasoline as a way of dealing with Russian oil being shut off. And of course, that's going on now with some of the other countries. Gorbachev won the Nobel Peace Prize, you may remember, for his dealing with the breakup of the Soviet Union. So here's how Lithuanians felt about him. That's the Lithuanian flag and country being stabbed by Gorbachev. And you could put the Ukrainian flag and Putin in there. I don't think Putin's going to win the Peace Prize, so this to me is really frightening. This is like history repeating itself right now. And also they have their Hitler and Stalin and I think Saddam Hussein too. So they liken Gorbachev to that. Okay. This is 2015. The last time I got to see my friend Vytautas Pernulis was in January of 2015. And he took me to his childhood home. And he also took me to the border with Kaliningrad. So this is a monument to Lithuanian going way back medieval times. But behind me is Russia. And he wanted me to see the border between those two areas. This is the cemetery where the students were buried who stood in front of the tanks singing "We Shall Overcome," arm in arm, and were just mowed down, thinking, oh, this is Tiananmen. So this is on top of this cemetery and a memorial near the TV tower in January of '91. This is the Parliament building in Lithuania, very important for democracy. They liked at that time as an American, they saw me as a, beacon of democracy. I don't know what they would think now, but and we all stood around there. We signed petitions. They put up barricades. We didn't know if the tanks would come or not. Fortunately, they did not. The Russians decided not to storm. They could have easily stormed this parliament, the Seimas, which is there. The Seimas, by the way, has recently voted to send weapons to Ukraine and aid to Ukraine people, refugees there. Most of them are Poland, but a few are in Lithuania. And so here are some of the barricades. The bottom photo is the last Red Army parade in Vilnius in November of 1990. They would celebrate the Soviet liberation. And it got pretty rough. People were saying, we don't want a military parade in our city. Why don't you just leave? So that was the last one. Here's the Soviet military base behind a hill. And those are two officers. I probably would have gotten in trouble if they saw me taking their photo. But so they very quietly had these bases that they kept to try to keep them out of sight in these republics. And so they're no doubt setting these up now, again, in Ukraine. Here is a Russian soldier with a bayonet. So I did get close enough to do that. That is the statue of Lenin, which is now no longer there, on the square next to KGB headquarters. Lithuanians didn't like to hang out at this square because that was KGB headquarters. People were tortured there in '91. In 2015, I'm happy to say that KGB headquarters is open and you could go in and stand in the cells. I did in the basement level in downtown Vilnius. So this was a scary place for Lithuanians. Who's in charge of that soldier? You might say Gorbachev. My experience though is maybe nobody, maybe some local colonel was in charge. And that was another thing, kind of the arbitrariness of what happened and what's going on in Ukraine. So there are small Russian tanks on the right, and they are surrounding the TV tower. And this should again sound familiar. You go in and go after where the communication is, right? You want to control the communication. So they sent the small tanks in the day. This is pre-YouTube, pre-internet, because they wanted the media only to see the small tanks. The big tanks came in the night, and they would rumble down the streets, and the Soviet glass in windows like these would crack and break. And so that was scary. Even if the tank didn't fire, all the windows in your apartment might be cracked. And that was kind of the Russians saying, we're here. Okay. And the big tanks, then they tried to keep out of sight. These were smaller tanks. This is not Vilnius. This is downtown Stalingrad, Volgograd in 1991. And so the irony of this is that after seeing all this destruction by Russian tanks, I went to Stalingrad, and they keep this building up there from the siege in 43, 44 to remind everybody, they told me, of the folly of war. So you can talk more to our friend Konstantin Globalin about this, because that's where I met him. And so this was the irony that I would go to a Russian city and they'd say, oh yeah, war's not good, and look at this, given what was going on in Vilnius. And again, suggests that idea that there's no communication, from one group of Russians to another. There's the TV tower, and this is before the Soviets seized it. This is a Lithuanian guy who showed me around. They have a nice restaurant up there, and they were very proud of it. And this beamed across Lithuania. You might say this is ancient history, but in Russia now, most people, and they're older than 50, they get their news from TV. So the TV is the main way that Putin spreads his propaganda right now in Russia. You're up against the TV, not against the internet. Oh, there's another one. So the TV tower then would be a main point of attack by the tanks. And so those small tanks you saw are surrounding the tower, but the heavy ones came at night, and they seized that, and they seized a couple other buildings as well. But this was still, in their minds, part of the Soviet Union. So they were like, this is an internal map. Okay. What happened after this? Well, unlike Prussia, the Lithuanians have survived. About a third of their population that's left. The tanks did not win. Vilnius was not laid waste, and the tanks withdrew. Gorbachev, General Secretary of the Communist Party, by the end of that year was gone. December of 1991, the Soviet Union disappears, and President Yeltsin takes over. Where did the Russian tanks go from there? Well, they went to Moscow. So we had two Russian tanks in the streets of Moscow in 91 and again in 93. So those Russian tanks are still roaming around, but now inside of Russia, which is pretty scary. But the Lithuanians thought, okay, we're now finally free. We can have our own country. And all of this space that you see now, except for there, all of this is now NATO territory. So we're committed to sending American troops, and there are a few American troops in Lithuania right now, if the Russians do attack. You can see from the map there, Belarus, which is a close ally of Putin. So you can see that if you regard Belarus as Russia, there's that little gap between Kaliningrad and Belarus, okay? And that is NATO territory. Okay? That is very important militarily. The Lithuanians now are quite scared what will happen, because that would be an obvious place to expand the war. The grain from Ukraine, some people have said, will come up through Belarus, and Lithuania has offered its port Klaipėda as a way to export all that grain that's now rotting and causing food problems in the rest of the world. So that's an issue as well. So this then had an effect on me in that, how do you answer to this evil? How do you answer to people who are, maybe not evil themselves, but doing evil deeds? And I think one way to fight that is transparency, right? To show what is going on with photographs and to look at what's going on in these economies. So that had an effect on my career, as that's what I do. I've been doing that for 30 years now, to kind of look at what's going on actually in these economies and make things transparent, right? Where's the money going? What's happening? And so the Lithuanians now are part of NATO, and so are the Latvians and Estonians, and they're very happy that they are, and they have given full support to Ukraine, but they're also extremely scared. And so the couple of people I know in Lithuania still that I saw in 2015, they want to support it, but they're also really scared. So they're actually glad that there are NATO troops there. And just kind of to conclude, an amazing thing has happened with tanks. Again, American tanks in Lithuania, but now there are German tanks. Once again, welcome in Lithuania. So that's a huge change in what's going on in the world now, what's happened with the German military. And that would be welcomed into these three countries. So that's my experience with Russian tanks. And I know that I will run. I know I will photograph them. But I think right now in Ukraine, as back in Lithuania 31 years ago, I think a lot of those tanks are not commanded by anybody. You hear about these generals rushing in to try to get things done. You might have a colonel, you might have some major or something in charge, but I think those tanks can do whatever they want, and there's no hope of getting up into the hierarchy. One thing the Ukrainians do have, and the Lithuanians had to their advantage a little bit, but Ukraine much more so, is since they liberated this area from the Nazis in 1944, they kind of froze that structure in their military. And they believed that, the great World War II victory, and it was a great victory, and they lost 20 million people, the command structure in the army hasn't changed much. And it's way too vertical from what I've been reading, and cannot deal with modern warfare. And I think the Ukrainians are doing so well, in part because the World War II victory for the Russians was so important, they froze their structure and can't deal with small group and guerrilla fighting that's going on. So I just wanted to share my experience with Lithuanian tanks and with evil, and going back to Hannah Arendt, she's been criticized. Can one do evil without being evil? I think yes, if you look at what these Russian soldiers are doing. So thank you.